And here on the main stage, I do have Paul Kohlhaas again, and I'm going to let him. Hi again. Ready for the second session?
Yes.
So it's a talk and then a workshop, and I'm going to let him take over. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks for being here again, guys. I hope you had a wonderful lunch break. I always actually find these breaks like the most invigorating because you get to talk with so many cool people and chat about what they're doing. So welcome back. We've changed this up slightly, so to actually immediately lead this talk into a workshop. I think we had a lot of really fascinating, intense talks just before the break, and I think it'd be awesome to kind of break the format up a little bit more. So in the context of, I think, you all getting to interact much more and actually also work on the topics that that you really enjoy. I'm going to try, make this talk shorter, and then actually also invite Tyler, Lawrence, Nicholas, Vincent, and actually any one of you as well who actually want to speak about some of the topics that I'll go into during this talk, because there's like a huge range of things to cover. And then the goal is actually to break out into smaller workshop teams relatively quickly, and just start jamming away. Cool. Okay. So the title of my talk is quite broad. It's called Liquid Singularity, Exploring the Financialization of Science. This was actually something. Okay. This was something that I think a couple of people started alluding to just before the break, and I think in the context of like DeFi meets DeSci, so the kind of the convergence of decentralized finance and decentralized science, I think is one of the most interesting aspects to me personally, also having a background in economics, but also I think one of the most scariest aspects of what's potentially happening here. I want to first go into like what we imagine for the workshop a little bit, and then I'll try to go through my talk a lot quicker than I planned to, just because I want to start working together, and then I'll just throw the word to one of these guys, or to any of you actually already during the talk, which I think will be fun. Cool. So just a couple of workshop prompts in the beginning, like what could we get to at the end of these workshops? I think the slot is for about 2.5 hours in total, so there's a lot of time. Which aspects of science could actually benefit from financialization? Which aspects might be hindered through that, actually? How could crypto empower scientists similarly as NFT empower artists in their sovereignty? I actually talked to a really interesting founder earlier who's building a DAO, for example, where they're using an NFT issuance system that is similar to Nouns DAO. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Nouns DAO, to actually fund research in Alzheimer's, which I thought was really cool. What is the impact of liquidity quite broadly in previously illiquid markets? Are there ways for instantaneously funding promising scientific ideas, for example, through crowdfunding? And then which new scientific funding models are uniquely enabled by Web3, such as Gitcoin quadratic donations, for example. So there's a whole range of topics that we want to explore here. And also kind of get, I think before the break was quite heavy on biotech, which I personally find it really fascinating subject as well. But we also know that there's many people here from very different areas of science. And what's really cool here, the principles that are being explored in IP-NFTs and in DeFi can be very broadly applied to any kind of scientific field. Cool, briefly this, we'll split into workshops and topics and groups afterwards. I already said that. There's a couple of ideas that we already have for that, but I'll get to that in a bit. Cool. So, wait, small caveat, a little bit again to drug development, but this is actually very broadly applied. So it's a question of how does innovation work today? This is in any scientific field, or even within the confines of a company. And this can also be mapped to how innovation works in small molecule development. So you essentially typically have like an innovation funnel where you have like a very large amount of ideas, different research projects that emerge, and that then essentially get driven through a funnel. You have idea generation, project definition, concept development, detailed development, until eventually you get to potentially commercialization or a market launch of an idea. And what I always found really interesting is, ultimately this is a really inefficient process, because all of these processes typically happen within the boundary of a firm or the boundary of an organization. Early idea development or early concept development is very rarely shared in a more holistic fashion. So if you take a pharmaceutical company, for example, they will go through this entire process of developing a drug just all by themselves. They will rarely share their innovation. It's very hard for other researchers to come together and work on an idea together. And if you think about these closed innovation funnels, that's actually a really, it's a very inefficient system. And something where software development, for example, has really succeeded over the past, let's say, 2 to 3 decades. Software development used to work exactly like this. You used to have giant companies like IBM, Microsoft, did everything in-house, didn't share their innovation. In fact, Microsoft used to call, when open source first emerged through the Linux Foundation, really, Microsoft used to call open source a cancer that would destroy the software development industry. And open source software development kind of broke up this model and said, like, hey, everything should be shared and we should collaboratively develop innovation together. Unfortunately, the licenses and the IP frameworks that enabled that in software haven't been possible to implement in other areas of research yet, or there's very few areas. So this is why, at a broader sense, what the DeSci space is starting to do with IP is really interesting, because it's taking those original notions of open source, and in this case open science, into new business models that might actually enable that in a similar way that we saw it in software development. Very basic recap. Why is IP actually broken today as a driver of innovation? If you think about it, IP and most patents, so patent systems, are really fundamentally still physical assets. Typically, you have like the boxes of documents that you go through, countless filings, you have to renew the patents. And at the same time, data has become a completely digital asset. But if you think back actually 30, 40 years, companies used to have giant filing cabinets with all of their data. It used to be all physically stored. With IP, that hasn't really changed. You still have lawyers that will compile hundreds of pages around a specific IP asset, and often that IP is not digitally native, it's not easily shareable, and it's not easily transactable. Then the second thing is, and Sebastian also said this very well, IP as a driver for innovation is if it has a very monopolistic design, and that just leads to market failures. It really fundamentally limits collaboration around research. Organizations tend to work in these silos that we saw earlier. It limits open science. In the sciences, we have a large negative data problem. That there's just no incentives. If I'm, for example, working on a project, it could be a new engineering design, or it could be a medicine, for example, and we continue getting negative data that it's just not working, and the company is financed with hundreds of millions, or the research project is financed, has public grant funding, we don't actually have an incentive to share that it's not working if our funding depends on it, and if we have shareholders, for example, that invested for it to work. So often negative data doesn't get shared, and then and then you try to get rid of the IP, so maybe someone else can capture value from it, instead of just killing it very early on in the innovation cycle. So the basic thinking is, if positive and negative data was shared in these systems in a very early stage, IP development could be much more efficient. Ultimately, patent and trademark systems are incredibly outdated and bureaucratic if you've ever tried to work with them. It's like among the most atrocious user experience imaginable today in a digital age. IP then itself is a very illiquid asset class. It's very hard to transact in IP if you compare it to other assets. But IP is worth billions. I mean, most companies are fundamentally built around owning specific IP assets, yet they're so hard to transact in. And ultimately, that also hinders people, scientists, for example, across the globe, to easily get into that value creation process. Because it's just like, even the cost of filing a patent or engaging on a patent strategy are normally prohibitive for anyone to really start. And as a last thing, IP valuations are notoriously hard. Like, it's often, for early stage IP, it's often a complete sum thug of what something might be worth. There's entire studies around IP valuations, but ultimately you don't know until you're quite far into the development cycle. On the other hand, financial markets are very efficient resource and capital allocators. Like, they tend to go, like, hypothetically, also speaking. I think we've seen a lot of exuberance and sometimes greed in financial markets over the past decades, unfortunately. But in principle, financial markets and open markets can allocate capital and resources much more efficiently than, let's say, just single people. Like I would argue that a market for open IP and open research projects would be more efficiently able to allocate than a grant issuing authority. And I think actually we're already seeing this in early experiments with systems like Gitcoin. Wait, did I have a slide on this? Actually, sorry, one slide is missing. I was going to show you how the current patent, if you ever want to get a good understanding of this, go onto like the USPTO website and just try to look up a patent, and you're met with, you think it's a joke that this is how the system works. Or go onto systems like AIM, Autumn is the technology transfer and kind of university association in the United States. Most IP transfer and discovery systems are just so out of date. And so I think for DeSci and for the broader community, there's a huge potential to innovate and to actually allocate resources more efficiently. So what could this look like so moving into IP-NFTs, and this is, what could DeSci look like in 2049? And maybe some of you know this like reference to like Blade Runner 2049 is like a very futuristic view. And there's this, there's a point in time which Ray Kurzweil and also like folks like Peter Diamandis have written about, which is commonly called the Singularity. So the Singularity is a point where artificial intelligence essentially transcends human intelligence, where innovation happens more and more quickly. And so one thesis that I have, for example, is that I think something like the Singularity will only be enabled through DeSci once we fundamentally break open kind of the current shackles that we have on how innovation is done, so that it can actually start accelerating beyond a point of no return. There's a broader question of whether we want that. Like, would we ever want actually artificial intelligence to transcend human intelligence? Unfortunately, I think from an ethical point of view, it will happen whether we want it or not. And then the goal should be for systems like that, for a system like the Singularity, whatever you want to imagine it to be, to actually be collectively owned and to be collectively discovered, rather than be in the hands of single companies that have become efficient, that have kind of become more efficient than collective human intelligence. So I always thought it would be quite interesting for if you actually develop super intelligent AI algorithms to actually be housed within IP-NFTs, and then through that to be developed in the public. Because if the public was able to own these algorithms and collectively develop them together, I think the chances of those systems ultimately becoming good and helping humanity are much higher than them belonging to companies like Google or Facebook. Because that's the other alternative in terms of how our public innovation systems work today. So ultimately, research should be more in the open and collectively owned. And I think the technology that is emerging in the DeSci space ultimately can make that happen. Okay, so in the next slides, I very quickly want to go into IP-NFTs and how they can be used, and then how IP-NFTs can be financialized, and kind of what we're currently seeing in the space. And then I want to jump right into the workshops. Quickly want to ask you guys, do you want to add anything? All good? Okay. Should I speed it up? Yeah? Okay, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but NFTs have quickly moved beyond art. I think Vincent said this to me yesterday. This chart is actually a little bit outdated. I think it's from August. In August, I think we were at around 1 billion in terms of volume through NFT platforms. And I think in January, we cracked 20 billion in volume through those platforms. And I think it's incredibly interesting to start broadening this beyond art. And this is where VitaDAO, together with Molecule and others, has started using IP-NFTs in Biopharma. And so an IP-NFT is really a new fundraising mechanism for any type of early stage research. And it's a technical framework which allows combining an NFT as a transactable asset with a federated data storage system and an access control system. And then it's also a new legal framework. So I want to go a little bit into the anatomy of an IP-NFT. So on the one side, it's a legal contract. So it's a contract, a license between two parties. So if let's say if Tesla wants to work with a university on electrical engineering for a new engine component, they would typically approach that university and engage them through a contract research agreement, which means Tesla might be sponsoring the research at that university, and in return, it would own the corresponding IP and the corresponding data. So that's just a simple legal agreement. in the same vein, one of you could actually go to a university, and if the university accepted, you could sponsor some research. You could then spin that out, turn it into a startup. That's how the world works today, in terms of how we actually engage and spin out IP out of academic institutions, for example. And what we've done with the IP-NFT is you simply attach that legal agreement now to an NFT that is transacted between two parties. But now that transaction can happen in a fully digital way. The only thing that you need to do is you need to have KYC the owners. There's actually a problem that we can get to a little bit later. What about anonymous owners of IP-NFTs? But so if the university knows, hey, we're out-licensing this to this company or to this individual, they're sponsoring the research, and thus they own the corresponding data and IP. Then the next component of the IP-NFT is storage. So the IP is the actual IP, so the legal agreement that describes the work that's being done, as well as all of the data are stored in a decentralized file storage system. This can be on Filecoin or Ipfts. It can be on Arweave. We actually have both of those teams here. I think Garrett from Arweave is running a workshop later this afternoon. If you're actually keen to get like technical and your hands dirty in terms of how do these storage systems work. And what's interesting now is by combining that, you're now able to transact all of the research data legally and the whole IP in one transaction, in the same way that I can send someone a normal NFT of let's say, I don't know, picture of a crypto toad. I can send that to someone with my phone, takes 2 minutes. In the same vein, I'm able to transact the full legal rights of a research project and all of the corresponding data. The data is actually not public. So the data is almost like a decentralized Google Drive, and the NFT owner now has an access key that it can give to anyone. So I could say, hey, this research institute gets access, this research institute gets access, and also maybe there's an investor who wants to fund this, also give access to them. And so it essentially becomes like a decentralized data repository that is immediately exchangeable. It's transactable, has the normal features of an NFT. This also means now you can develop different, let's say, financial bidding systems around it. You could say we're issuing this NFT for an auction, or it's directed one-to-one for a fixed price. Or, and we'll get to this later, you could fractionalize ownership in it and kind of sell it to a much larger group of people. And because it's transactable, it's now also ownable. It can be owned by individuals, it can be owned by organizations, or for example, it forms the building blocks of DAOs. So now we have research organization or research DAOs that are essentially now building portfolios that are building portfolios of these IP-NFTs in the same way that that a Tesla would do that, or that a biotech organization would do this. And what we started essentially building here is really mirroring the execution patterns that we see in industry today. But this could really also be applied. You could start a climate tech DAO that is investing and funding IP in climate tech research. So the areas where this can be applied are very wide. And then lastly, NFTs are fundamentally programs. They're fully programmable. So you can give them governance functions. It's essentially distributing governance between multiple participants to decide how to further develop the IP or what to do with it. You can enable fractionalization, which means currently you have one owner for an NFT, but you could create 1 million subtokens of that NFT and distribute that. And so you could have 1 million owners, or you could have 10 owners that each own 100,000 shares of the IP-NFT, and they all now collectively vote on what's being done with it. You could code in programmatic royalties or like milestone payments. We actually have another really cool, and these are all different features that are already being built out in the ecosystem from different teams. We actually have Jesse here in the very end who co-developed the Friends framework. So the Friends framework is one of the first legally compliant frameworks that we've seen. Has yet to be tested in the world, but that essentially enables this fractionalization. And then the last one, we also have a team here from Crowdfunded Cures. They're, for example, developing pay-for-success models, where you could have a payer that pre-funds specific work to be done into an IP-NFT, where the payment triggers once specific milestones or like data milestones are met. Okay. This is just a nice overview again of the different components. And what I'm trying to do here is just give give you guys like a basic overview that you can then also take in these workshops. Again, there's a legal contract. There's a smart contract that runs on Ethereum. The legal contract is referenced in the smart contract. The legal contract is then actually stored in the encrypted file storage, and there's a metadata JSON that essentially, even if the encrypted file storage is lost, makes the IP universally kind of secure. I think I've talked mostly about this. So with an IP-NFT, you can essentially really transfer and finance research and IP at the earliest stages without needing to create a patent, because you've essentially secured the IP in something that makes it transactable and fundable. You don't need to create a startup, because in our hypothesis, many startups are often created, not necessarily because the IP is already good to go, but you simply needed funding to even prove a hypothesis. And so what you actually end up with, many companies that are in the market that, let's say a biotech company that then has raised 5 million out of the gate because their investors made it to, and there's a researcher now that he or she just wanted to prove a thesis, and so now the money's there, bought lab equipment for $2 million, and now 6 months in, the thesis shows it doesn't work. IP doesn't work, and then we need to pivot into some other area. So actually, the industry today forces us to create many, many early companies on scientific hypotheses that wouldn't actually need to exist, because maybe the thesis could have been disproven with a killer experiment that would have costed 200K. And so what's actually really interesting, we can potentially, with these IP-NFTs, massively increase the amount of early stage research that's being done by spreading it much wider onto a much broader set of experiments, because the friction is now so small. The friction to really just start funding research. Then the other thing is, I'll skip through a couple of these because I want to give it over to these guys. I'll skip through this. So IP-NFTs are now really interesting because they become Web3 Lego blocks, and so something that we saw really grow in the decentralized finance in the DeFi ecosystem over the past 2 or 3 years is that Web3 systems really succeed because they're so modular. And now the interesting thing is you can think of these IP-NFTs as they can be inserted in a lot of things. So you could, first of all, you could fractionalize them, and you could spread fractions of IP-NFTs through different decentralized marketplaces, essentially creating liquidity depth around IP-NFTs. Doesn't matter what the underlying IP actually is, it's just this is possible. And like other people, if we build out Web3 in as open frameworks, anyone can now plug into these financial primitives, and someone could start building with your IP-NFT if you allow them to. You could, for example, create lending and borrowing market on IP-NFTs. You could have people doing appraisals of your IP in a fully decentralized fashion. You could say, hey, this IP-NFT got funded for 250K, and I want to take out a 50K loan now on the IP. Will someone give me a loan on that? And then there already is in existence multiple decentralized NFT marketplaces that essentially, one is called Niftify, another is called NFT Finance, where you can now take out loans on NFTs. Just, I don't know where exactly that would lead now in the context of like using research projects or like IP as collateral, but I think it's really interesting to like think about these use cases. In terms of enabling access to research data, we talked about that earlier, where the IP-NFT now essentially acts as an access key. And then I think with DAOs like VitaDAO, and actually would love to give the word then to you guys, we're already seeing a lot of this modularization. So where DAOs that purchase these IP-NFTs are now very actively thinking how they can plug them into different parts of the ecosystem. If they could spin out sub-IP-NFTs from these, if they can spin them into companies, they can raise further funding on them. Yeah, maybe I want to leave it, I want to take a small break here, yeah?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things, just something that I realized during the break, chatting to a few people. I think we have like a really large audience of scientists that are not Web3 native here today. So like maybe just at a super high level, doing like a sort of temperature check, who in the audience feels like they understand NFTs to a small degree? Raise your hand. Okay, and who feels like they understand NFTs to a significant extent? Okay, great. And in terms of also like, do we feel like we have a reasonable understanding of what a DAO is? People who understand what a DAO is, put your hand up. Okay, pretty solid as well. So probably like half the audience. So maybe just a lot of these things, I think one thing that I would personally love to do a workshop on today, if it was possible, is actually the communication around a lot of these things. So one of the biggest challenges that I've encountered, whether it's talking to scientists or researchers, is how do we simplify the jargon, the buzzwords, and the dynamics around all of this conversation. Like something like an IP-NFT, you could also say it's like owning equity in a research project, for example. That's a really simple way to understand it. And the extent to which we need to understand like all the technical components or with the tech stack in the back end, like sort of remains to be seen. But I think it would be interesting, maybe one thing that we could do, and I don't know if this is that part of the talk where we sort of figure out how we self-organize into workshops, but what's that? Oh, okay, do you still, okay, so okay, never mind.
Which one is that?
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Okay. Do we want to consider like topics for breakout sessions specifically? How do you want to drive it? Okay.
Maybe you can finish the. Yeah, I can. I'll finish the very high level quickly. There's a couple of challenges also with IP-NFTs today. I'm not going to go too much into. I feel like it gets very, very deep, but ultimately IP-NFTs at the moment is still really closed data. So the owner of the IP-NFT ultimately has to decide whether they want to open it up in the context of open science. But ultimately, the possibility of already adding multiple collaborators, it's almost like a private GitHub repo that you could later on turn into a public GitHub repo. We have to be considerate there of how to actually not kind of break the IP. The sad thing about how IP works today is it's very difficult to like make IP open unless the IP is not protected. So there's a fundamental problem actually there. What we've done with IP-NFTs today is make them much more transactable and liquid, but they're not yet much more fundamentally open unless you as the IP owner want that to be. Another really big topic to really fully enable Web3 is to enable anonymous transactability of IP-NFTs. So right now is you need two legal owners to essentially transact in an IP-NFT. A really, I think, interesting research question is how do you enable fully anon ownership for IP-NFTs? And I think this then also, quickly, there's two interesting ways to actually solve that. One is to wrap the IP-NFT. This gets deep into DeFi, but there's interesting models from a team called Nexus Mutual, where they've created different wrapping functions for their underlying tokens. So you can wrap it into like a wrapped IP-NFT, which then anons could transact in, but they couldn't access the data. You're going to have a data problem. Or, for example, by people putting up deposits to view the data. Because ultimately, there's always a problem. How do you prevent leakage if you open these systems? How do you prevent someone from just kind of copying all the valuable IP that's there if you have anon ownership? And then a last big topic that we can get into is liquidity and price discovery. So currently, for example, in the way that we've seen some biotech DAOs essentially use and negotiate these systems to negotiate for IP-NFTs, because it's typically like you have a researcher, a research team, or a university, or a biotech company. It's typically still a relatively, let's say, one-to-one process in terms of how a buyer and a seller agree on a price. So I think what will be very interesting going forward is to enable much more like public auctions and public liquidity, and then also secondary sales around IP-NFTs. Yeah. And now to get into funding models. So one really interesting funding model I think that we can discuss as a workshop are systems that can replace current potential grant funding systems. And for example, via quadratic funding system through matchmaking and donations, or through direct microgrants, such as the VitaDAO fellowship that we've seen. And so I think the recent Gitcoin funding routes, for example, on longevity have been a massive success. We've had probably over 20, 25 researchers and projects from across the world that got funded through that system. And these are non-IP-NFT related projects, so these are pure grants. And then additionally, we're developing new mechanisms for decentralized science prizes. There, for example, I think we have someone from Mirror XYZ actually here today as well. So there's been really cool crowdfunding experiments through Mirror XYZ by scientists who have actually just crowdfunded for their scientific publishing or for their scientific study through Mirror XYZ, and then kind of given those crowdfunders different ways to be incentivized and to participate in those projects. Vincent, do you want to say a word about this? Or you ran the Gitcoin.
I think it's just interesting to see also there is already like millions of funding happening for completely public goods funding in science. So I think like also for the workshops like beyond IP-NFT and more for-profit drug discovery research, there's already like multitude of different ways to fund public goods, which I think can be even explored further. Like, I think Gitcoin is still fairly primitive, for example, but it's already in the 15th round, and we'll have a DeSci round actually in September with them. So yeah, for all the projects here, get free money there. Like,
and maybe beyond having projects like Gitcoin that enable unconditional funding, I think there's still a vast design space to think about what are sustainable ways to fund the commons. So in LabDAO, we think about this lab exchange a lot, and you take fees on the exchange where people can pay other labs to generate data for them, and then there's a fee levied on it, but that fee flows into the commons, flows into the lab fund, which then gives stipends to more developers to actually build on that exchange, to build more applications for the exchange. So you kind of have like I think sort of a next era in open source potentially, even where it's like the Linux Foundation would charge you a small fee every time you run Linux code, and that small fee would actually make the foundation extremely independent of whether like big companies want to donate to it or not. It would be independent, and I think that is something we should probably go towards, and something that we can go towards with the financial primitives that are now available to us.
Okay, so this is, and I wanted to stop here because I think this is one really interesting subsection for a workshop that we can get into, and one that is completely unlinked, for example, from the, like, let's say, more commercialization-focused research around IP-NFTs. Cool, we actually went through this. And so how would an IP-NFT actually get fractionalized? And VitaDAO actually, I think it was in Lisbon, developed a first, a VitaDAO hacking team in Lisbon developed the first kind of approach to fractionalizing one of its first research projects. So essentially so IP-NFTs are custom ERC-721s with a custom metadata. And you can fractionalize them quite simply by moving that IP-NFT into a fractionalized vault. That means essentially turning the ERC-721 into an ERC-20, or turning, if it's an ERC-1155, turning parts of the ERC-1155 into fractions. And then what you can do with those fractions, with ERC-20 fractions, for example, you can put them into systems like Uniswap, so you would immediately then have liquidity for the underlying IP-NFT, or you could auction them off using mechanisms like Gnosis auction. And so what you essentially do is you calculate an implied NFT valuation given that trading price. So essentially, if you took 20% of the ownership of the IP-NFT, you fractionalize that 20%, and then you obtain a public market price, which it would probably take a while to settle. But this would be a very interesting mechanism to essentially also obtain valuations for IP. And in the case of VitaDAO, for example, to enable VitaDAO, one of the research projects that it's funded that is very actively essentially succeeding to essentially allow much broader participation in a single research project. So for example, the members of VitaDAO, they're really interested broadly about longevity, but maybe you're not interested about VitaDAO, maybe you're just interested in this one very specific project. And so what's interesting here is that you can actually, so VitaDAO right now is more like a big, and I think we have a presentation on VitaDAO tomorrow. We can also do like a workshop. This could be one interesting workshop case as well. How does one of these fractionalizations actually work in practice? And I think the team then also, we ran into many issues. Well, how do you sort out governance? What you do is, essentially once you put it into a vault like this, the IP is also somewhat stuck. So then you need to think of how do you actually get the IP out of a fractionalized setup again. Ultimately, fractional IP is, I think, a really interesting use case. It gets back to like what I was saying in the beginning. So essentially you can create prediction markets for fractional IP once you enable tradability. And in this case, if positive data emerges around an IP-NFT, and I think you guys were actually talking about shorting research projects earlier. If positive data emerges, that would increase the price of the underlying asset. If negative data emerges, it would likely decrease the price. So it's like knowing that this engine design works, or actually no, it's going to blow up. And if you know that it's going to blow up, then you probably maybe you don't want to hold onto the project anymore. So in these cases, market participants now has incentives to reveal data, analyze the data, and place their bets accordingly. It's also really interesting to think about the implications here for insider trading. Like if people can now generate scientific data or have incentives to generate scientific data, how does that actually implicate the definition of what is insider trading. Especially if, let's say, if the IP was open for anyone to research, and so anyone could run a study and be like, actually, this is probably not going to work. And then that financial data actually becomes valuable. So what's really interesting here is just, and this then is for me, the hyper-financialization in the context of open science. This would really, I think the ability to go long and short research projects would really enable the emergence of entirely new business models within science. You could have a team of researchers that form to prove or disprove certain hypotheses in these IP markets. So you could have a team of like scientists at a university just get together and be like, we're going to scan this market and we're going to find assets that we believe are overvalued, that could not work, and we're going to try and disprove their thesis. Which today, there's no real incentives to do that. There's no real incentives to go out and produce negative data. Or often you're simply just not allowed to do so. Like if a big pharma company is developing a drug, you're not allowed to like start researching their drug or produce any kind of negative data sets about it. But ultimately, that would be really beneficial for society. Maybe things, if we go back to the very beginning of this like innovation cycle, maybe things would then fail much faster. Let's go to the end. I agree. A last thing, we could have meme stocks for science, but I'll leave that for another time. So let's jump into the workshops. Maybe I first want to open it up to questions, thoughts, or should we just jump right into the workshops? I also really want to welcome any of you to come up. I think we've seen this group also, except for Lawrence. We haven't heard Lawrence talk a lot yet. But
yeah, I think the idea is to basically, for the workshop structure, to have different tables to assemble in small groups to discuss specific topics, like also the downsides or risks. And I think like anyone that wants to basically lead a workshop around a specific topic can come upstairs to more like pitch in the topic they want to discuss about, so others can join their workshop into discussing it. So it could be me saying, I want to do a workshop on public goods in the context of this, and then people could join my table to discuss this topic. So anyone that wants to come up and discuss a specific topic can do so. I think we have like room for probably like 6, but also potentially much more workshop tables. Like we could also move downstairs with other workshops. And I think the original idea was that the core, like a leader from the workshop, if they want to, could present almost like an elevator pitch, 30 seconds of the core idea they came to, or like a core idea they want to present. But I think from the time we're fairly limited, so we have like 45 minutes, I think, left. Yeah, so I think we have like probably like 30 minutes for a workshop and like 5 to 10 minutes for presenting it. So I think that's why I think it makes sense. Basically, our idea was to also lead with some topics we want to discuss, so we can go through the topics we want to host, but it would be like not all of us on one workshop, but basically helping also to guide a specific one. But I think from the format, it would be more like a brainstorm as well on a specific topic. And it could be purely on the risks of financialization. The context could be on how to do IP-NFT, fractionalization. And I think we could lead with some topics, but would also like love if specific topics you're excited about to break out in a workshop, to just raise your hand or come up front to present idea you want to workshop.
I think what interests me, I'm not so much into longevity and IP because I study philosophy and psychology, but what interests me is the financialization of the publication process of science, because currently it's captured by the big publishers, and I would like to see how can the scientists actually capture this value that's already there and is taken by outsiders.
Choose a table maybe that you're
going to do. Yeah, right here in the front on the right.
All right.
What's your name again? Jonathan, thank you.
Yeah, Johnny or Jonathan?
Okay, Jonathan's going to that first table with this. He's going to write his subject. Anybody else? Okay, Adam.
Yeah, I'm going to go after. I can go. Maybe I can just go. So we're going to do one workshop, and it's going to happen downstairs. And this is for all the people that actually produce biomedical data. So the people that care about labs, the people that have a CRO, the people that have are early within the research process. And we want to talk about basically these sort of scientific data NFT. So we didn't talk about it that much during Paul's talk, where we're thinking about sublicense that are tokenized, but actually data itself can also be tokenized. If you want to talk about that, meet us downstairs. This is actually not only interesting for people that work in labs and produce data or think about labs, but also patients and patients that have data that they want to share. So just an example, a group of breast cancer survivors coming together. And I think we can meet down there as well.
Hi, I'm Lawrence. I'll be at the second table over there talking about BioDAOs and more specifically VitaDAO, the first longevity research DAO, and actually the first DAO that actually funds real-world research, and probably also in general about why a DAO versus a regular VC fund or companies. So I invite everyone, skeptics too, any question, no dumb question. I think it's important to get people from various different backgrounds to chime in and maybe spark some new ideas.
Perfect. So I would host a workshop on IP-NFT, fractionalization, and financialization. So I think maybe on the third table.
My name is Adam. We are going to host a conversation about psychedelics and the intersection with crypto. And given the unique trajectory of psychedelics over the last 50 years in our culture, why DAOs may be able to offer unique innovations for us in our society and their development in the marketplace and otherwise.
Awesome. So Adam's going to be on table 4 over there. Any other volunteer? Oh, amazing. Okay, Sava here.
Yeah, so basically I'm really interested in using retroactive public goods funding for incentivizing development of therapies where patents don't really work. So basically repurposing off-patent drugs, plant medicines. I think we've got a lot of synergies with the psychedelics folks as well. Yeah, so I don't know where we'll do it, but maybe in the back there.
Table 5 for you. And any other volunteers? Climate DAO, social good DAO, anything else? Okay, hold on. We have somebody here. Make sure you say your name, please, and thank you.
Yes, so my name is Albert Anis. I've initiated a new BioDAO called ValiDAO, where we focus particularly on biomanufacturing of everyday goods, such as foods, biomaterials, biofuels, and so on. So I would love to invite people here to discuss how we can kind of fund this kind of research and apply the framework such as the IP-NFT or a DAO in this kind of research context. So I guess...
Yeah, you get table 6. And I just want to remind you that we have a whole other area downstairs, so we can do many more. I have a hand here. And a head. Oh, no, you didn't know, you were just stretching. Okay, now you have to do one. I'm joking. Here you are.
Hey, everyone. I'm Duncan. Yeah, maybe quite often one of the things that goes into sort of funding research normally is there's like bioethics panels, like assessing impacts of the research as well. Maybe how IP-NFTs could have that potentially encoded in them could be an interesting thing to discuss. Literally thought about it a second ago, but yeah.
Yeah, so you're going to go downstairs. And what's your name again, sir?
Duncan.
Duncan. So Duncan's going to be downstairs with us. Anybody else? Okay, we have another one. Amazing. There's plenty of room, so you can still decide. Here, right? Just make sure you say your name.
Hey everyone, I'm Manav. I'd love to talk to you guys about research incubation and basically funding, tokenized funding of grant programs. So maybe potentially multi-DAO grant programs where you have a fractionalized token and basically equity research, mainly in the context of healthcare practitioners and life sciences researchers. So if that sounds interesting.
You're going to be downstairs, so say your name again, sorry?
It's Manav.
Okay, Marlon. So Marlon's going to be downstairs. Anybody else? Or we're going to start breaking into the tables. You can see the titles at the front.
All the leads should come there and just check the titles.
Okay, so every lead of a workshop, please go to the front and check the titles, and then everybody else can also check and break out into those sessions. I'll also be announcing them when we're all set up. We're going to do the 1-minute presentations for all the workshops. Hope you really enjoy them, and I look forward to the presentations. I ask each one of the presenters to stick to 1 minute. I will be timing it. I will make 10-second announcement and 5-second announcement, and may the best presentation win. I'm not going to tell them what they're winning. Anyways, thank you guys. We're going to start with Vincent and the IP-NFT fractionalization. And then John.
Perfect. Yeah, so we discussed IP-NFT fractionalization, but also pretty beyond that, just topics around IP-NFT. So beyond IP-NFT fractionalization, we really discussed this conflict of open and closed data, because you can't really make all of it radically open, because then you lose your patent claim. So we almost like also picked up this example of like a private GitHub repo where you can collect a lot of data. Everyone that is a stakeholder or has the IP-NFT access key can access all the data. And then at the end, like once it failed or succeeded, you can actually make it public. And then one interesting topic was also what happens if an IP-NFT gets hacked or lost. And we discussed kind of like more like social recoverability could be one thing to look at, like with wallets. And then another high-level topic we discussed was like the discoverability of quality research. And of course, I kind of like looking also at the patterns that are currently very popular, like citations or quality, or like famous institutions, but to move beyond them and also to have new mechanisms for discovering quality research. But I want to hand it to the next one.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, so we discussed basically the financialization of the publication process, and we were first talking that it's currently the financial value goes to the publishers, and they provide some value, which is that they curate, so to say, what gets published and what gets thrown out. And at the same time, we were thinking that the value of the scientists that they create is basically the paper that you want to read. And so how do we capture this value? We had different ideas here, where one is the scientists themselves have to kind of be the curators, which they already are because they are doing the peer review. But they could have maybe a decentralized algorithm like a blockchain that is basically a track of scientific record in a sense, and then you have to pay to access in a sense like what is behind that in that. That was something that would clash with open science, so we discussed this for a little bit, and we didn't quite find a solution there. Then we had another idea, which would not be a consensus algorithm, but just a, so to say, a validation market where you bet onto or you invest into replications or tests of hypotheses.
All right. So I have a very big pile of disjoint notes, but I think you can break it down into 5 steps. So we were thinking a lot about how research data is generated and how this sort of atomic layer of intellectual property, which is just proprietary information, how that looks like. We thought about storage. And something that stood out to everybody was, okay, it really depends on how do you structure that data. And ideally, we just adopt standards around bioimages or sequencing data that are already available. Why reinvent the wheel? And rather just marry these things with decentralized storage systems. Then data access. This data has to be visible and discoverable. So again, work with the existing infrastructure players, but also list scientific data in new formats on new exchanges as well. Metadata was a huge topic. How does metadata evolve? You know, today we don't think that you probably have to know the room temperature when you do an experiment, but then in the future, maybe we realize we really need that. So metadata has to continuously evolve, and I think that's where DAOs are really important. And then last but not least, we also thought about reputation and how there needs to be multiple reputation systems for scientists to be chosen to do a laboratory experiment.
Thank you. Next is Lawrence, 1 minute, and then pass your mic, please.
Yeah, I'm Lawrence. We talked a bit about BioDAOs and more specifically VitaDAO. We've talked about where these DAOs can come in the pipeline. So, you know, from the basic research, mostly funded by philanthropic entities and the public government agencies, and then we have VCs. and traditional investors coming in when an asset is de-risked enough for them, but there is a value of death in between, the translational value of death. And so we come in to fund projects where they're mostly still either an idea or stuck in academia, and de-risk them for then a new company to be spun out. We also talked about what happens with the proceeds, how they can be reinvested, and what could be in the future voted by the token holders, and how we can allow strategic contributors to come in. We talked about how we launched, and our fair auction, the Gnosis auction, sort of a Dutch auction where everyone got the same price. There were no pre-sale, no investors. The only people bought the token. Anyone could buy the token, including the team. And then there was a vote for giving a budget. We also talked about which projects we funded and how we curate projects, and the dangers and how to choose the domain experts that curate those projects.
Thank you, Lawrence. Next, Adam. And I'm going to give you the mic.
We started off with a governance proposal to move downstairs where it was quieter. And basically everybody made it. I was really impressed. Like, we had this whole scouting mission to go find a place where we could hear each other, and we got through it. So I thought that was a very strong start. Following that, we talked about building a distinction between kind of the current medical model of psychedelics and therapeutics, but also this kind of the cultural model that maybe is left out of some of the current institutions. We talked about laying a foundation of research, of primary research, and then translational research. We talked about legal structures a little bit, and what it means to be a DAO as a digital native organization, and how that might have interesting intersections for psychedelics as well as the biotech marketplace. And we talked a little bit about being anonymous versus not being anonymous, and the values on each side of that. We talked a little bit about reputation capital as it relates to, say, a trip sitter who might be anonymous or not, and how you might validate people in the community. And then we ended by saying, does anyone remember our second governance proposal? No? Okay. We decided that it was very important, and we should continue talking about this.
Thank you, Adam. Great. Next one's Nick.
Hey, everyone. So at Crowdfunded Cures, this was the discussion that we had around retroactive public goods funding. And our hypothesis is that there's a ton of compounds and drugs and potential therapeutics out there. FDA approved, around 90% of FDA approved drugs could be potentially repurposed for new therapeutic uses. We also have psychedelics, we have cannabis. These are compounds or potential therapies that have a weak patent around them. So we're looking to work together to figure out ways to develop incentivizations to put those through clinical trials and develop clinical trial protocols, which we could then put into IP-NFTs and then sell off to payer systems. So the discussion was more along the lines of these potential therapeutics as well as treatment regimens. So that's pretty much what we focused on for that discussion.
Thank you, Nick. And last but not least, Albert from Valley DAO.
Yeah. At Valley DAO, one of the main things that we want to do is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable bioeconomy using biomanufacturing. One of the things that we discussed is, so there is, a huge amount of research going on in academia, particularly within synthetic biology and biomanufacturing, focusing on materials, fuels, chemicals, and so on that can, really influence various environmental issues. And the main problem that we discussed is that how can we get this research to the market, and using DAOs, using IP-NFTs to collaborate with the researcher, and tapping into the community at a very, very early stage to together with them de-risk the project, and kind of also look at the commercial opportunity. And also, what you can do later on is you can, for example, spin out this research and have for example, the professor being on the board or as the main advisor for that startup. So yeah, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to thank you there.
Well, thank you, everybody. And the winner is everyone, because it's a team effort and you're at DeSci.Berlin, so everybody wins.